I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to Games is Lit 101. Today we're talking about a relatively little-known reboot, at least as far as AAA reboots of classic franchises go, I suppose. They got kind of iffy critical reception and probably doesn't have a huge cult following that'll click on a video to listen to some guy talk about it for about an hour, but I want to, so we're gonna. I've talked at length about my fondness for Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time, as well as my deep-seated hatred of its edgy, try-hard sequel, Warrior Within. Which is why I'm moving straight on to the 2008 reboot, instead of putting myself through that edgelord nonsense. Now, if you really want me to suffer through the grungy dumpster fire of a sequel that is Warrior Within, well, I will accept a pristine PS2 copy along with $1,000 in the mail, with no return address, or else I will just send it back to you. Short of that, no, we're not doing that. We're doing this instead. Anyway, once Two Thrones drew that trilogy to a close and sales had been steadily declining, Ubisoft decided to reboot the series entirely with the 2008 Prince of Persia. Sporting a new art style, new characters, and a more open structure, Prince of Persia 08 sure was a game that happened. The game sparked some good old internet discussion about difficulty and punishment in video games, but aside from that, it just kind of released to mildly positive reviews and then dipped off the radar. Not only did it never get a sequel, Ubisoft opted instead to make a mediocre midquel to the Sands of Time games instead of continuing where this game left off. This one did get some DLC to wrap up its story, by which I mean add a new and slightly different cliffhanger, but frankly, I think that it takes away from the game a lot more than it adds, and our policy here anyway is to talk about the game as it was released, as it exists on its own, not counting DLC or extraneous media. Point being, it would be perhaps a bit generous to call this game a cult classic. It's more like a decent game that released to decent reception and then was just kind of forgotten about, and people don't really think about it much anymore. But nonetheless, it does have its fans, including me. Sort of. Kinda. It's complicated. I'm not gonna lie, there is gonna be a decent amount of complaining in this video, but not because the game is bad. It's just a game with a reach that far exceeds its grasp. It tries a lot of interesting things, and some of them work, and some of them really don't. Which is what makes it interesting to talk about in the first place. So alright, let's get into it. As always, we will be summarizing and discussing the story in full detail, so if this game piques your interest at all, I highly recommend playing it for yourself before watching this video. It's available for the Xbox 360 and it's playable on newer Xbox systems, the PS3 and PC. So, let's get started.
The wind is free, but the sand goes where it is blown, unaware of the world around it.
As the game opens, the titular prince has lost his donkey, whose name is Farah. That's a little jab at the previous series that I can't decide whether it's funny and loving or mean-spirited and cynical, but said donkey has a load of dubiously acquired gold, but an unexpected sandstorm separated her from the prince, and while wandering around to find her, he stumbles on a princess named Elika. Elika is an Urin princess whose father is trying to free the evil god Ahriman, who was imprisoned over 1,000 years ago by the Urin god Ormazd, who then left the world and tasked his people with guarding the tree and ensuring Ahriman never escapes. But after 1,000 years, the Ura's magic began to fade and its people began to leave. The once great civilization slowly declined until there was little left of it. And now, the king of the Ura is trying to free Ahriman and Elika is trying to stop him. After a brief battle with the prince and Elika, the king cuts the Tree of Life and sets Ahriman free, corrupting himself with Ahriman's dark magic in the process. So at this point, the prince is well and truly tangled up in this apocalyptic crisis and agrees to help Elika imprison Ahriman once again. This is done by purifying Ahriman's corruption in a number of fertile lands. So the prince and Elika journey throughout the ancient, decayed Ura civilization, taking on 4 of Ahriman's corrupted generals: the warrior, the hunter, the alchemist, and the concubine. Over the course of this journey, the prince and Elika get to know each other, settle some differences between them, and of course, develop feelings for each other. This is kind of a weird one to summarize, by the way, because there's not a whole lot of plot to be had in this game. Pretty much everything that happens in it exists for little reason other than to incite conflict between the prince and Elika that helps them to understand each other better and grow closer as the story goes, and that's the sort of thing we're going to be diving into in detail when we get to the analysis section. So for now, a short summary this time, I guess. Each time our two heroes take out one of Ahriman's generals and purify new fertile grounds, Elika's father shows up to fight the prince again, growing more visibly corrupted each time and triggering a vision for both Elika and the prince. These visions eventually reveal that Elika had actually died recently, and that her father, the king, begged Ahriman to bring her back to life in exchange for his freedom. Ahriman granted his request, and Elika was resurrected with newfound magical powers. Elika's quest to imprison Ahriman again is driven both by duty and a sense of guilt that he was freed in the first place to bring her back to life. After driving Ahriman's generals from the land and purifying the lands they corrupted, they have the opportunity to seal Ahriman away for good. Elika's father tries to stop them, now fully a thrall to Ahriman, but he comes to his senses just long enough to throw himself into the abyss rather than hurt his daughter. Ahriman attacks the two directly, but they manage to escape him long enough for Elika to heal the tree, at which point she apologizes to the prince and seals Ahriman away, including the magic that was used to resurrect her.
No!
The prince carries her body out to the altar as the credits roll, and the player is left with an empty area with only 4 objects they can interact with, the 4 healed trees. No other choice to continue the story but to go to them and cut them each down. So the prince destroys the trees, freeing Ahriman once again and bringing Elika back to life.
Why?
The game ends with the prince carrying Elika away from the temple as Ahriman once again escapes.
What is one grain of sand? What is one grain of sand?
It's an ending that caused no shortage of controversy, though admittedly it paled in comparison to the controversy caused by certain gameplay choices, but we'll get to all of that in a little bit. For now, that was the basic, overall, if drastically simplified story of Prince of Persia 08. So, let's talk about how this game works in relation to the series it's coming from, in relation to how it implements its gameplay and story, and what that story is trying to say. Since this is a reboot of a long-running series, it's worth taking a second to examine the various differences, similarities, and reimaginings that govern how it relates to previous Prince of Persia releases. Well, I say that like it's about the whole series, and on some level it is, but while it certainly relates to the series as a whole in various ways, this game feels first and foremost like an attempt to recapture the magic of Sands of Time. It looks and feels very different, and in a lot of ways it is. Combat is entirely about one-on-one duels, a callback to the original game, but very different from the mobs of enemies faced in the previous few. The open-world approach calls back a bit to Warrior Within, but the structure is very different and bleeds over into the storytelling far more profusely. The art style is completely new to the series, of course, and that more colorful vibe is joined with a far more jovial writing style that fits the snarky Nolan North voice work, making it feel at times more like a modern action comedy than a historical fantasy epic.
I'll go first. But hey, you're staring at my ass. I felt you looking.
I thought you'd lost your ass.
Donkey. I can feel you looking.
Just climb the tower.
But dig a little deeper down to the skeleton, so to speak, of this game, and it's remarkably similar to Sands of Time in a lot of significant ways. After all, the switch to a more light and colorful presentation could be seen as a direct refutation of the grim-dark edgelord nonsense that defined the trilogy's later games. And it's a game about the titular prince navigating an unfolding apocalypse as a backdrop to a story that's ultimately more about the budding romance between himself and the woman he's traveling with, who's the only other particularly developed character in the game, which is, in broad strokes, exactly the same as Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. The game's endings take this idea in very different directions, particularly in exactly how the prince grows as a character and how that growth informs his decisions, but we'll be getting to that in the analysis proper. The basic story is pretty much the same, is what I'm saying, which is not to say that this is a rehash, not at all. In fact, I'd probably argue this is an ideal approach to reimagining an old story. You know, take what really defines it under the hood, but then take it in some new directions, give it a new sense of identity. It's honestly a pretty good approach that respects and builds on the source material in meaningful ways. All that to say, this game isn't quite so far removed from the Prince's previous incarnations as it might seem to be at first glance. And while we're talking about conventions and expectations at the time of the game's release, indulge me for just a moment for a quick little sidebar about game mechanics. I know that's not what this channel is about. I promise we will be getting to the story stuff in just a second. This is just something that's honestly kind of been on my mind for a long time, and I want to talk about it. When the game first released, one of the most pervasive criticisms was that the player couldn't die. If the prince ever falls, Elika saves him immediately and plops the player back on the last solid ground they've been on. If the prince is defeated in combat, Elika saves him and the boss gains extra health by way of punishment. There's no way to actually die in this game and get a game over screen, only to suffer minor setbacks. Criticism at the time said this made things too easy, that it turned the whole game into a toothless game for filthy casuals that didn't have any challenge to it anymore, but I mean, honestly, if this game came out today with this same mechanic, could you imagine even noticing it, let alone getting mad about it? We've long since figured out that there are far more interesting, not to mention less frustrating consequences for failure than literal death and loss of significant progress. It's not even all that different from the Sands of Time games, really. They had a rather generous mechanic that let the player rewind time if they ever died, or even if they just took more damage in combat than they would have liked. And even if the player ran out of sand and couldn't rewind any further, they weren't all that stingy with checkpoints, so there wasn't much progress lost. I was gonna compare this to when shooters began using regenerating health, and some players had to acclimate to this new mechanical trend and the different, but nonetheless very legitimate, purpose it serves to the game's dynamics of play. But even that seems like a bit much, because that was at least an actual design shift. This is almost entirely aesthetic. Mechanically, failure kicks you back to a checkpoint. That's all. It works pretty much identically to a lot of other mainstream games of the time, but people complained that the game was too easy, or, God forbid, casual. All because the prince doesn't actually literally die or get a game over screen when the player fails. It's all kind of baffling in hindsight, especially now that these kinds of light consequences are so pervasive in the medium and understood to be entirely compatible with high difficulty, but crucially, even then it wasn't actually much of a departure from popular game design. So next time someone's whining on the internet about easy modes or something, I guess just take comfort in the fact that the whole discourse surrounding difficulty and the disdain for casual games has pretty much always been at least a little bit petty and kind of far removed from any solid understandings of game design. You know, same thing, different forms. Anyway, narratively speaking, where this game differs most from the ones that came before it is in its structure and its theming. So let's talk about the former first. I know talking about structure is kind of dry and boring compared to other elements of a story, but I actually really think that the structure of this game, both in gameplay and in storytelling, is probably the most interesting, ambitious, and flawed part of the game as a whole. So just give me a chance to tell you why. There are two overarching principles behind the story structure of Prince of Persia 08. The first is a form of the collection structure, and the second is a semi-open world. Since my video on the subject is ancient at this point, a quick summary of what I call the collection structure. The collection structure is my term for the common method of video game progression based around a number of items that must be found and collected for the story to continue. The 4 elemental crystals, the 8 fragments of the Triforce of Courage, the 4 star maps used to locate the Star Forge, what have you. And of course, it doesn't strictly have to be a matter of finding and obtaining plot-important objects. The Mega Man games follow this structure, for example, even though rather than collecting things, you are defeating enemies. Same basic structure regardless. The defining feature of the collection structure isn't what the protagonist is looking for or what they do to it, but the fact that everything the player has to do to progress the story is outlined from the start, and the plot doesn't have to progress in any significant way until those things are accomplished. Which is why it's generally something of a pet peeve of mine. The collection structure in its base form, at least, means that nothing interesting or important or significant needs to happen in the story except at the very beginning and very end. It's essentially a blank slate to just not bother writing a second act. The collection structure is really handy for easily outlining what a player has to do over the course of a game, but narratively, it's usually not very interesting. That said, plenty of games have figured out how to tell a compelling story with the collection structure, to varying degrees of success. The most common method is to make each collection quest a story in its own right, essentially splitting the game into a series of loosely connected short stories. This is fine, but can easily still feel like filler if it's not done carefully. But Prince of Persia 08 takes something of a different approach, and one that might actually be one of my favorite attempts at a collection structure story. Because, yes, it is very basic collection structure. There are 4 generals that you need to defeat in their 4 corresponding areas, and the plot doesn't really move forward much during that time. But it still doesn't feel like wasted time, because when it comes down to it, the story isn't really about all that plot nonsense. It's about the prince and Elika. The whole Ahriman is trying to take over the world thing is little more than a framing device to put the 2 main characters into a situation where they have to work together, overcome hardship, and come to understand and love each other before putting them in a situation that forces them to make an impossible choice. Even the bosses are basically just ideological foils to one or both characters' worldviews, packaged in a menacing antagonist with a thematically relevant backstory. The whole overarching story exists not for its own sake, but to challenge our protagonists and force them to grow. So in the end, the second act of the story that the collection structure generally renders kind of toothless and empty actually just ends up focusing on what the story's really about here. So I think it works pretty well, and it doesn't really bother me in this specific game. On its own, at least. This is where the open world comes in. Obviously, this isn't an open world in the sense we've come to popularly refer to it now, games like Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring, where the player has more or less complete access to the game's entire area pretty much from the word go. But it is nonetheless a type of open world structure, in which the player navigates linear corridors to visit locations and take on challenges in whatever order they choose. As a structure for the gameplay, this actually works pretty well. It's quite elegant. Really, it makes traversal fun, it gives the player some agency in how they tackle things and progress through the game, and feels almost like something of a mix between the hub worlds of older games like Crash Bandicoot or something, and the Metroidvania-style flowing map design. Unfortunately, it doesn't do so many favors for the story. Each of these 4 areas belongs to one of the game's bosses, and as I hinted at in the summary, each boss presents a specific ideological challenge to one or both of our heroes, effectively making each of these areas their own separate story arc. Again, from a gameplay perspective, this works just fine. It encourages exploration, it allows the player to take on some optional platforming challenges, and it makes the decision about where to go next a little more interesting. But it also means the story of our 2 lovebirds, and thus the focus of the story as a whole, has little consistency and essentially no discernible arc to it. In a more linear format, a romance like this would develop over time and grow over the course of the story in a way that feels kind of natural. But with this non-linear format, that's pretty much impossible. I suppose with more modern innovations you see in games like Hades, using randomized dialogue systems and such, it would be possible to make that work, but this Ubisoft game from 2008 does not do that. The player can take on any of these areas in any order, so if one was written to reflect the early stages of this developing friendship, and another was written to show it developing into something deeper, the whole thing would be rendered nonsensical if the player progressed in any other order than that. So each area, essentially, has to be episodic. No meaningful change that would alter their dynamic going forward, no interactions that would feel out of place in the opening moments of the game, and no consistent development showing them grow closer to each other, just individual interactions that can be shuffled in wherever the player happens to find them. That is certainly not ideal, to say the least, from a storytelling perspective, though in the interest of fairness, I do think the game manages to create kind of an illusion of progress simply by having decent character writing. The 2 have chemistry, and they consistently come to understand each other more through these conflicts. It's also helped by the way our 2 protagonists are animated, always physically interacting and helping each other as they climb and fight. There's just so much touching and visible connection between the two in the moment-to-moment play that they might end up having better physical chemistry than the Prince and Farah ever did in Sands of Time. And those two actually had a sex scene in that game. The real problem is in the fact that the game actually breaks each of these arcs into at least 2 separate parts. Not only can the player leave in the middle of one of these arcs to go take on another one, the game literally makes them do that. Over the course of the game, the player uses collectibles called light seeds to gain the ability to interact with different types of magical plates that allow Elika to get herself and the prince into new areas. It's sort of a clumsy attempt at Metroidvania mechanics. These abilities do effectively allow the player to enter new areas and access new challenges, but they also have literally no use in the moment-to-moment play. They're just a way of getting the player somewhere they couldn't be before. But that's beside the point. Each of these abilities allows access to the boss of 2 areas in one arc and 2 areas in another. So the player can only take on half of an area before needing to move on to another to find enough light seeds for the next upgrade. Are the two fighting about whether redemption is possible for the warrior? Well, the player is going to have to leave to take on the concubine before that conflict resolves, so the two of them are suddenly back to friendly banter until you get back to the warrior questline, at which point they're magically mad at each other again. Is Elika flirting with the prince and offering him a place with her after this is over? Because you'll inevitably have to go elsewhere, and she could go right back to snarky dismissal of his every advance. The semi-open world structure of the game effectively scrambles up the progression of this core relationship. It's like watching a romantic television show with the episodes on shuffle. Open world story structure is a fascinating subject, one that we're still, to this day, seeing a lot of iteration and innovation on. We still haven't quite figured out the best way to handle this. This game seemed really invested in approaching that subject from a unique and interesting angle, and while it is indeed those things, the results unfortunately don't work out all that well. The writing and characterization of the game is thankfully good enough to give the characters life despite this, but it is very much in spite of this structure rather than in cooperation with it, because the game keeps forcing the player to essentially go back and forth between different character arcs in progress. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about when I say there's nothing wrong with linearity. Some games just work better with a linear structure, and some stories are better off without the myriad narrative challenges presented by non-linear progression. This game may not be as extreme in its open world structure as many, but even so, the execution is enough to make the story progression all wonky. But that's not enough to completely counteract what the story is trying to say. Despite these issues with execution and presentation, the overall message of the game still comes through fairly clearly. For the most part. So, let's talk about what Prince of Persia 08 has to say about love, purpose, and ambition. Our two heroes are very different, and yet a lot alike. These differences and similarities are explored in 4 distinct ways over the course of the game. Each of the 4 areas of the game has its own unifying theme, essentially creating a 4-part character study before offering a conclusion through the ending. So before we get into our conclusions, let's talk about each of them. In no particular order, because the game doesn't order them, so why should I? Let's talk about the Alchemist first. This general of Ahriman was once an influential scientist in the golden age of Uran society, but his ambition gave way to fear when he began to age and realized his experiments and knowledge would end with him. So he made a deal with Ahriman, his soul upon death in exchange for the formula for eternal life. Said formula, however, was so complicated that he wasted the rest of his life in pursuit of making it work. When he finally died, Ahriman collected his soul and gave him that which he sought, eternal life, so long as Ahriman himself still had his own life and freedom, thus giving the alchemist exactly what he wanted, along with incentive to keep Ahriman alive and in power. During his time as Ahriman's general, he forged corrupted weapons that would slowly transform his conscripts for Ahriman's army into monstrous creatures deprived of their humanity. He also enslaved the Uran people to build colossal plumbing structures that would pump corruption throughout the city. After Ahriman was banished 1,000 years ago, that same infrastructure was repurposed to become the city's aqueduct. Now, the corrupted alchemist fights in service to his master, to keep Ahriman alive and give him back his freedom, and thus continue his experiments into eternity. That backstory itself offers little to go off of. It's essentially a cautionary tale about ambition without nobility or purpose. While scientific discovery is undoubtedly a good thing, and the alchemist even used his expertise for the good of Uran society for much of his, initial mortal life at least, the moment that ambition turned to selfish ends, his work became, quite literally, corrupted. But the main way these generals contribute to the overall story and themes of the game is in how they interact with and incite conflict between our two heroes. And the nature of the Alchemist's legacy is something that the Prince and Elika disagree on often over the course of this arc. The Alchemist berates the two of them for being incurious about the world and blindly following their own convictions without concern for what else might be around them.
It is not that you cannot understand, it is that you do not even question. Knowledge enlightens. You close your eyes in blind faith.
This is a somewhat interesting idea, since it is true that both Elika and the Prince don't really try to challenge their own worldviews without significant prompting, but it also doesn't really relate to the rest of the story all that much. What's more interesting to me is how he uses their differing ideas about morality to sow discord between them. Elika sees the world through a lens of absolute good and evil. Ahriman and everything that comes from him is evil, while Ormazd and everything that comes from him is good. Whereas the Prince sees things from a far more relativistic, or perhaps just consequentialist perspective. Nothing is good or bad in itself, only used for good and bad purposes. It's a fairly simple disagreement, one that further defines these characters and the ways that their worldviews differ from one another, but what I particularly appreciate about it is that it doesn't just refuse to take a side. Instead, it actually bothers showing the good and bad consequences of both of their approaches. This conversation in particular was my favorite.
You use this to feed the city with water? So not all the Alchemist machines are bad.
Oh, they are. We just put this to good work after he had been imprisoned.
Elika is pretty directly confronted with a flaw in her logic here. If these machines are inherently evil, then they couldn't have been repurposed for good. Clearly, it's more complex than she wants to admit. Elika doesn't really come around on this issue, even despite being rather clearly shown the flaws with her reasoning here, and that's intentional. For better and for worse, this game is far more interested in exploring and defining these characters' worldviews than fixing the flaws in them. But she's not the only one who's a little wrong here. Between the Alchemist trying to outright destroy the fertile ground so it couldn't be restored, and that bit in the backstory where the Alchemist's weaponry served to corrupt the Uran people, it's clear that some things are good only for their intended purpose, whether good or evil, or for destruction. If the Alchemist had a way to turn the fertile grounds to his own ends, you can bet he would have. We see here the kind of character development this game is going for, and depending on how charitable we want to be, it's either the perfect fit for this loose, open structure, or a necessary limitation forced on the storytelling by that structure. So let's talk about the Concubine next, because I think that she's the one that provides the most interesting conflict for our two heroes. The Concubine was an Uran woman who used her power over men to gain influence in the kingdom, but she caught the attention of another such powerful woman who had her beaten and scarred so badly she could no longer hold her usual sway over the men of the court. Her source of power taken away, she turned to Ahriman. Okay, let's just get this out of the way real quick, because I think it's fairly obvious that this is at least a little bit sexist. I mean, the only woman of these four generals, the only woman in the game, aside from Elika, managed to get her way into power by manipulating men with her sexuality, and then she turns evil because her beauty is taken from her? Like, in all fairness, not that this series has had a stellar track record with its women, necessarily. Despite that, the Concubine's areas of the game are by far my favorite, because they comment on more issues and do so more effectively than most. Let's talk about the first point of contention she presents: action and experience versus knowledge and dreams.
If you don't dream, you will never be more than you are.
And if you don't wake up, dreaming's all you'll ever do.
The Prince and Elika's differing ideas about life come in part from their upbringings. Elika has spent her whole life inside the palace of a dying civilization, highly educated but nonetheless very sheltered, always dreaming about the things she's read of but never actually experiencing them.
If you've never had a boyfriend,
I'm very well read.
there are lots of things best experienced in person.
As for the Prince, the game doesn't reveal a whole lot of his backstory. It does make a point to establish that he's smarter and more educated than he comes across, but he's still a far cry from nobility, to the point where he's actually not even a prince. He's just an orphan who struck out for a life of adventure rather than live with his uncle.
Were you young when you lost your parents?
Old enough to understand it was time to run away. My uncle took me. My parents stayed to protect the city. They'd collect me once it was safe. They never collected me.
Must have been difficult.
People live, people die. They chose to die for someone else's cause.
Your parents died with honor, to protect other people.
They died. Does the rest of it matter?
As his impulsive decision-making throughout the game makes clear, he sees far more use for action than knowledge, more value in experiencing the world than he does learning about it. Elika's faith in Ormazd engenders a degree of passivity that the prince does not share. She believes that an all-powerful guardian guides her, or at the very least has provided all she needs, and that her role is merely to follow the path laid out to her, while the prince has spent his life entirely bereft of such guidance. Why would he share her sense of divine purpose when his whole life he's been the only one looking out for himself? So while Elika's decisions are guided by this divine mandate placed on her existence by an absent god, the prince lives his life under the belief that the only person who has any interest in his success or happiness, and indeed the only person he owes anything to, is himself. And again, it's best to refrain from assigning either of them as completely right or wrong, because this arc with the Concubine throws wrinkles into both of their worldviews pretty effectively. The Concubine's command over illusions and dreams demonstrates how easily the prince's self-centered worldview can be tricked into the same passivity he criticizes Elika for, as he could easily just give in to false pleasures and legitimately enjoy himself. The Concubine knows this and needles the prince about his directionless approach to life, even as she tries to tempt him into a false reality where all his needs and pleasures will be met.
Golden riches, tender kisses, power, strength. Close your eyes, my prince, my king, and we shall taste your dreams together.
At the expense, of course, of any potential for him in the real world with other real people that he could affect. Elika, on the other hand, is already being confronted with the apparent absence of her god and her need to insert herself into the situation and take control for herself rather than rely entirely on Ormazd. And her conversations with the prince make clear that she is indeed not satisfied with a life of dreaming and learning. They both do know what they're missing. The prince clearly does have a desire somewhere in there for a more stable life, because the possibility of having that with Elika does seem to appeal to him on some level.
The whole give me a city thing. This is you saying you want me. Admit it. You want me to stick around. That's why you want to give me the city.
That's what you want to believe.
And Elika does long for the reality her dreams and books represent. But she's far more comfortable living with this clear vision of her purpose and her future than she is abandoning those things to live her life more freely, just as the prince is too jaded to accept that he might be able to live with more love, care, and purpose than he currently is.
Trusting your own judgment can get lonely.
You rely on someone else, they'll just let you down.
You haven't let me down.
You haven't known me long enough.
This also feeds into an element of their romance that goes largely unexplored outside of this segment, but is nonetheless pretty vital to understanding what happens in the ending, the thematic tensions present in it, as well as the choices these two characters make. As the Concubine needles the two characters about their differences and the ways their experiences of the world fall short, she also uses this to undermine their growing connection by pointing out that they want different things out of life and can't really be together after all this because of that. It's a cheap ploy to drive a wedge between them, but it rings of truth, and Elika acknowledges as much.
Some of it was true, though. I do serve my people, and
Hey, I'm looking for a way out of here without a dark god chasing me across the desert, alright? Don't worry about me, princess.
No, of course not. We'll finish this, and then you can find your donkey.
And you can get back to ruling your people. Everything back as it was. Just as you wanted.
Well, we haven't finished this yet.
This kind of thing is why this is my favorite of the four arcs. We see these two characters growing closer, but we also see not only their personal reasons for maintaining distance, but the practical challenges that would await them should they try and pursue any kind of lasting relationship. They're not trying to fall in love because it ultimately wouldn't really work. They're just falling anyway. Given all of that, it is perhaps unsurprising that this segment is also home to what I would probably argue is the game's best moment of directly interactive storytelling. Before the final battle with the Concubine, Elika is taken. She disappears, and the Concubine produces illusions and tells the prince to choose which is the real Elika. But the solution is not for the player to cleverly figure something out and recognize which one is real. It's for them to jump off the edge of the arena.
Knew you'd save me.
Because Elika always saves the prince when he's about to fall. It's just a fascinating collision of gameplay and story in a situation where they were sort of implicitly understood to have a one-way relationship. Elika saving the prince every time he falls is just a narrative justification for a gameplay mechanic. It's not supposed to be taken seriously as a diegetic fact of how this story progresses. But in this moment, it is. The game asks you to consider it as a thing that actually happens in the story between these two characters instead of just a thing that happens as you're playing the game. The player is, in this moment, putting trust into the gameplay systems. That even though the narrative has stolen Elika from the player, she will still save them if they fall because that's how the game works. Players are generally conditioned to overlook these kinds of connections between gameplay and story because they generally exist more or less to smooth out dissonance between the two, and often they don't hold up to scrutiny. But the game calls attention to it here, requiring the player to think outside of those conventions, and in doing so, requiring the prince to put his trust in Elika. For a character who's convinced that he's better off relying only on himself to be put in this position, where he has to step out of that comfort zone entirely and rely on someone else, is a compelling character beat on its own, even if it probably would have been better in the later parts of a more linear game than here, where the player can simply do this at first and immediately have this big moment happen. But communicating that moment by requiring the player to think outside of their own expectations for how the game is supposed to behave is one of those simple narrative design moves that really show off how interactivity can uniquely contribute meaning to storytelling. So alright then, 2 down, 2 left to go. So let's start this next section by talking about the Hunter, because I think he's got some really interesting bits that... Oh, never mind. My notes here say that the Hunter is just some dude who liked murdering people, and he's super cool and clever and tries to kill the heroes without ever talking to them or engaging with their ideas in any way. Cool. Seriously, were the writers out of the room for this part or something? There's literally nothing that builds on the game's central relationship or themes here, just an arbitrarily evil dude who wants to kill them for fun. There's one kinda interesting conversation where Elika gets upset that the prince seems to be enjoying himself during battle, almost like there's some kind of connection to be drawn between him and the Hunter who kills for sport. But it's never really addressed outside of that one conversation, and frankly, the prince comes across as kind of a selfish douche sometimes, but we'd need a lot more explicit confirmation that his non-committal selfishness has actually legitimately hurt people before that comparison could go anywhere anyway. So the whole segment just feels like a waste, narratively speaking. That is actually all I've got for the Hunter, so let's talk about the Warrior now. The Warrior was once a king of a peaceful nation that came under siege. He refused to fight back at first, but the enemy did not relent. So he made a pact with Ahriman to become a powerful warrior and save his people, but could not return to them afterwards out of shame for having betrayed everything they stood for. His peaceful past does show through in the present as he shows a reluctance to harm the prince and Elika, pleading with them to turn back so he won't have to hurt them.
It is not too late. Turn back. Flee.
There's sort of an interesting but clumsy attempt to explore this theme of pacifism during gameplay by making the warrior himself invincible, so the player must use creative solutions like knocking him off the arena or letting him charge into fragile scaffolding. But the warrior's pacifism has less to do with this arc than his honor and his purpose. What he did for the good of his people, and in Elika's mind at least, that does him no small amount of credit. The conflict between the prince and Elika for this arc centers around whether the warrior can be redeemed. There's sort of a consequentialism versus deontology thing going on here. Is there a nobility in doing an awful thing for good reason, or do the harmful results of your actions corrupt any good intentions you may have had, or even any good you may have legitimately achieved? The prince thinks the warrior is just plain evil, like any other corrupted, but Elika disagrees. She thinks the warrior had good enough motivations that there may still be hope for him.
He sacrificed his life for his people.
He did it so people would talk about his sacrifice.
This taps into the prince's cynicism and Elika's optimism, with the prince assuming that anyone who sells their soul to Ahriman for power must have purely selfish motivations behind it, and Elika accepting the possibility that there may have been some noble purpose, however evil the act itself was. Which is where the other aspect of the warrior's arc comes into play. The warrior did what he did, evil though it may have been, out of an obligation to protect and serve his people. And this is something that Elika deeply relates to in a way that the prince very, very much does not. She has lived her whole life for her people, to the point where she only really even understands and values herself in relation to her responsibility to them. She relates to the warrior in this, while the prince...
I am no people. I am me.
Yeah, not so much. Living for others, defining himself by his affiliations, just doesn't fit with his worldview and lifestyle. This all builds to the final battle with the warrior, where Elika tries to purify him of Ahriman's corruption, and he chooses, instead, to fall to the lava below. Not content with that statement on the warrior's sense of honor, the game actually has him return immediately afterwards, but on fire. He constantly loses health, and the player just has to avoid him until he eventually succumbs to the flames, granting Elika a chance to purify him before he, either attacks them or throws them to safety. It's left intentionally ambiguous so the prince and Elika can have another point of contention.
He saved us.
He tried to kill us, and we got lucky.
You can see how each of these arcs treads similar ground from different angles, really just trying to dig into how these characters see the world by throwing challenges and disagreements at them to flesh them out. Because when it comes down to it, it's going to be really important to understand who these characters are and what their motivations are if we're going to understand why the game ends the way it does. Hey, Game Prof from the future here. Apparently nowhere in my script did I mention that the mythology of this game is pretty much directly lifted from the Zoroastrian religion. It's one of the oldest religions in the world and comes from the area in which this game takes place. I did some research on it when writing the script, but shockingly, no amount of Googling a religion I know very little about made me feel I could add anything meaningful on the topic, let alone do justice to the subject of a belief system with such historical and cultural significance, of which I understand so very little. But it felt wrong to simply not mention it, so I do recommend looking into it if you're curious. On one level, Prince of Persia 08 is about power, about how we respond to stressful situations when we have the power to fix them in exchange for a terrible cost. But more importantly, it's about exploring the motivations of these specific people and why they make the choices they do in these situations. The game is saturated with this theme, but nowhere more clearly and in more detail than our two heroes. Over the course of the game, we see their knowledge challenged, their beliefs challenged, their assumptions about life challenged, but crucially, we do not see them grow. All of these challenges and the ways that we see them respond to things does not serve to refine them as people, but only to deepen our understanding of them. Because when the time comes, they act exactly as they were always going to. Elika, ever the dreamer who values knowledge over life experience and prioritizes her people over her own well-being, sacrifices her life in service of the cause she so highly values. And the prince, ever the pragmatist who values his own happiness over any greater cause or purpose, sacrifices everything Elika lived, fought, and died for, subjecting the world to an evil god because he couldn't bring himself to lose someone he cared about. The tragic irony here is obvious, but the fact that these two believe different things and act in service of different outcomes masks the fact that they are, on a personal level, essentially acting the same way. The prince has essentially given up on any kind of purpose in life. He's embraced his role as a grain of sand, just trying to take what pleasure he can from wherever the wind blows him. He has no purpose, no vision for his life, just a drive to enjoy the here and now, under the impression that there's nothing he can do to change his circumstances anyway. Elika, on the other hand, has a grand purpose, a cause for which she is willing to live and die. She knows the world can change based on her actions, and yet the end result isn't so different from the prince. She is trapped by this obligation and feels neither the ability nor the inclination to change her circumstances. Neither the prince nor Elika have control over their lives, even if for different reasons, and they both ultimately act precisely according to the winds to which they've surrendered themselves. And that's ultimately the tragedy of Prince of Persia 08, and one of the main reasons I think it maybe deserves a little more credit than it tends to get. I mean, it was hardly the first game to do the whole you have to do a bad thing because that's what the protagonist would do ending, but it was a far less common trope then than it is now, with Shadow of the Colossus being probably the only mainstream example at the time. I'd probably say this kind of ending wasn't really popularized until The Last of Us, a full 5 years later. Back when this game came out, it was kind of an outlier, especially for mainstream action games. To end an entry in a major AAA series on this note, with the world doomed because of a choice the protagonist selfishly made, and the player had to act it out, in 2008? That took some guts. In a way, it almost feels like my criticisms of the open world story structure were maybe a little premature. I mean, I do still think that it causes a lot of problems with structure and pacing and consistency over the course of the game, but it turns out this game isn't about character progression. It's about stagnation. It's about exploring these characters, but never changing or growing them as people. About showing a sheltered princess the beauty of a life well lived, but not enough to make herself feel worth saving. About teaching a cynical prince to love, but not enough that he would act in her interest over his own need to be loved. To show us who these people are, but not to change them into better versions of themselves. That's not the kind of story that works for everyone, which is probably a not insignificant part of the reason why not all that many of these types of games do, but it's also a lot of the reason why it's so interesting when one of them actually does. So yeah, the game is messy. It's got some pretty big problems, not just outside of this story, but in how the story is told. But oftentimes the messier games can still do something very much worth talking about. Thanks so much for watching. It's been a good while since my last video, so thanks especially to the patrons on the screen right now. They have been so patient and amazing. I'm working on an analysis of the house in Fata Morgana, as well as Fatal Frame 2 for Halloween. I actually hit 50,000 subscribers recently, so I'm putting a poll up on Patreon so my supporters can vote on a topic for a celebration video. Thanks again, see you next time.